This is Alex Rice from the North Fork John Day Watershed Council. I'm a restoration project manager over here.
Great, thanks, Alex. I'll go Bruce next.
Bruce Taylor, I'm on the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission.
All right, welcome, Bruce. Heather.
Hi, Heather Hendrickson with the Hood River Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm the district manager.
Great, welcome, Heather. Let's go, Jesse.
Good morning, everybody. Jesse Kirchner, Water and Climate Programs Coordinator at OWEB.
Thanks, Jesse. Kristen.
Morning, Kristen Larson, Executive Director at the Lucky Amute Watershed Council in Independence in the Mid-Willamette Valley.
Great, welcome, Kristen. Anne.
Good morning, I'm Ann Hayden Lesmeister. I'm an in-stream flow specialist in the water program with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Great, thanks, Ann. Helena.
Good morning, everybody. Helena Linnell, Biological Planning and Operations Manager for the Coqual Indian Tribe here on the South Coast.
Great, welcome. Let's go to Teresa.
Good morning, my name is Teresa. I'm the Planning and Partnerships Manager for Urban Green Spaces Institute in Portland. Thank you.
Great. And Dirk.
I'm Dirk Brenner with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. I'm a habitat restoration biologist located in Bend.
Great, thanks, Dirk. And then once again, my name is Eric Hartstein. I'm OWEB's Board Legislative Policy Coordinator. There's a few folks that reached out to let us know that they weren't able to join, unfortunately. But I think we have a pretty good group of folks here this morning, and we can power forward. We don't have any, well, let me back up a second. So going through the agenda, we had public comment, and then going really right into the second draft of the rule language that we sent out a little, I don't know, week or two ago. We don't have any public comment, so we're gonna, I think, dive into the rule language itself, and then we'll have some wrap up and next steps. And I think that'll be important because we've talked to a few folks between the first draft meeting and today, and I think what we'll be able to do today is work on the second draft language, and then if folks are comfortable, what we'll do is, if we're in a good spot, we'll see where we're at. But if we're in a good spot, we can bring back the third draft rule language. And we heard some concerns about, well, this is all pretty broad. How will this actually play out once you get into drafting the guidance for the grant applications? So I think we could do is bring back, I can't promise full guidance or anything close to that, but we can bring back some draft guidance, some language that would go into guidance for our grant applications, and have the RAC kind of chew on that if that works out okay for folks. Okay, I've seen some head nods, so I think we'll plan on that. We'll see where we're at the end of today. But I think that's the direction we want to go anyway. And before we dive into the rule language, it occurred to me at some point over the holiday break that, I don't know if I did a really good job of showing folks kind of where things are at in our rules. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. If I could find my share screen on this new version of I'm not even seeing, oh, there it is. Give me 1 second, here we go. So for folks that haven't seen it before. So this is the way our rules are set up. And I went right to our the Secretary of State's webpage where we have all of our administrative rules. So we're talking right now about our Division 5 rules, which are the OEB grant program. So if you open that, you can kind of see what's in there right now. We don't have any evaluation criteria, as we mentioned last time, in the regular OEB grant program. This would be in addition to. Where we see our evaluation criteria are in the divisions that are specific to different grant programs. So maybe I'll start with stakeholder engagement. You see kind of how it's set up here, and I'll go directly to the evaluation criteria, where we have how stakeholder engagement projects will be evaluated on. So we have 7 evaluation criteria for stakeholder engagement. And I think this is important. I think it was brought up last time, like we don't necessarily want to have a lot of additional climate related evaluation criteria to add to these 7 existing stakeholder engagement criteria, because it would skew any weighting, because these aren't weighted per se, but if we added say 7 climate related evaluation criteria, you then have 50% of the evaluation criteria for a stakeholder engagement grant would be based on climate. If we go to restoration, there's quite a few more criteria. I won't go through all these, but you could see how restoration grants are evaluated. So it gives you just a little bit of flavor. I won't go through all the different grant types, but I wanted to make sure folks had an opportunity to see how these will actually fit into the existing evaluation criteria, or at least know where to go if you wanted to take a peek at it. So again, this is accessed through OEB's website. If you're at all curious, you can also just Google OEB Oregon Administrative Rules, and this will pop up. So, any questions on those?
So Eric, where will the what we're writing here will be a freestanding under the broader section, the grant program?
So yeah, Bruce, good question. So what we're talking about now is it would be we would add something in here in the Division 5 rules for the OEB grant program. So I didn't pull up the Oregon Ag Heritage rules, which have their own separate chapter. And those could either go into the equivalent of the Division 5 in the Oregon Ag Heritage program, or we can tease those out and place them within those the Ag Heritage rules where you think that they're most applicable.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Thanks.
This is Kristen. I'm still struggling. So with the restoration and stakeholder engagement criteria you showed, those are, what OEB has translated into the bubble diagrams that we get when we're applying and understanding how the review team will use that criteria to evaluate and rank different applications. So in that process, how would these Division 5 criteria, so you said you want to add a bunch of climate change to those existing criteria for the specific grants because you'll affect the overall weighting. So what is the process going to be to apply the climate criteria? And I know we talked about it a little bit, and I'm still struggling to understand it. So I'll leave it at that, I guess. How will they apply in the review process?
It'd be the same. They would just be added. It would be in addition to these evaluation criteria.
So how is that different than having them added to, like if restoration had its own climate and if PA had its own climate. I guess I don't understand the difference then.
So why, so I think, Kristen, what you're asking is like, why don't we just go through and add evaluation criteria to, say, stakeholder engagement, and then one to, or a set to restoration and the technical assistance and so on? We could do that. And we've considered going that route. We thought, though, that if we stayed relatively broad in the Division 5 rules and then have them kind of apply throughout, that it would be kind of a more efficient process than to go through each division to try to approach it that way. But I see kind of pros and cons to either approach.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to come back to that. I'm still struggling. So you mentioned when, like in the stakeholder engagement, saying, okay, there's already 5 criteria, or how many are there? And if you added climate, it affects the weighting. But in essence, you are adding climate criteria, just sort of on its own page of bubble diagrams, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm still struggling with that distinction, I guess. And then I see Dirk's hand up, so I'll pause, but I'd like to come back to the Division 5 versus individual program piece.
Okay, sounds good. And let me just clarify, when I mentioned the, kind of the weighting, what I meant was kind of just the number of evaluation criteria. Because we're at, with the draft right now, we're at 3.
Right.
So, so it really doesn't matter if we do it in Division 5 or if we do it in the individual divisions for each grant type, wanting to kind of keep it at a modest number. So we're not like heavily weighting towards climate. It's a consideration that's going into the broader suite of evaluation criteria.
Okay, that's helpful because I saw the back to lumping in one, and that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, all right, thanks, Kristen. Go ahead, Dirk.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if if we put this into the Division 5, if the step down of it into the different grant programs could be kind of teased out, because I'm looking at our existing, evaluation criteria, the 3 that we have, and trying to think, well, how would a monitoring grant seek to further mitigate, climate and greenhouse emissions if they're just looking to monitor like a restoration or say a watershed. So I'm not sure they all would fit for each of the different grant programs. So maybe we could set some goals and then there'd be another process to kind of step them down and fit them into the different application process. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how this could all kind of, because the different grants are, so different in their realms, that having a set of requirements that fits each one of them is going to be really difficult.
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Dirk. Go ahead, Jesse.
The way that I see it, Chris, when you think about our bubble diagrams, we have usually like 4 different exterior bubbles, and then there's the one in the middle that says like the sweet spot where they all overlap, and that's when you get funded, is because you've, met criteria in all of those 4 bubbles. So now all of a sudden we would have a 5th bubble, and at all 5, they would be all next to each other. So you'd have 5 instead of 4. I'm just thinking of like the one I'm most familiar with is water acquisition program, and we have 4 bubbles. So it may be different in restoration, but I'm going to talk from the water acquisition standpoint. And so I think what we're wrestling with is that 5th bubble is going to be the guidance that we put together is what's going to help direct what's in that 5th climate bubble that's there. And so if we do it as part of Division 5, and what Eric I think was getting at earlier is like we can come up with some draft guidance for the different programs, for restoration, for stakeholder engagement, for monitoring, and share it with you all to get some feedback and say like, no, that's not really going to work for this particular program, or this is what we think the problems are going to be if you try to put this guidance in there in order to meet this evaluation criteria for this particular program, versus going through and like, for each individual program, defining what those criteria are from like in this process, and incorporating it into those rules separately. And I think part of what I'm also wrestling with it, and thinking about trying to do it individually per program, is I don't know if that restricts us in some ways as new information and things become available, because if we incorporate it into guidance, we have a bit more flexibility as to like, oh, there's new science that's come to light and it's gonna, like what criteria we wrote and it's now in restoration, maybe it's going to be like, we could have had to address it through this science that's now suddenly available, and we can't because we have to go through another rule revision process, and it's, really only occurs once every 5 years. Whereas if it's in the guidance, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of like, oh, we need to update our guidance because new information has come available, or like we've learned, for example, through having our applications open for a year and asking these questions, that people are just really struggling with this particular question. So we really need to update our guidance and like how we're asking them to meet this criteria, because we figured out over the year that it just isn't, it's not feasible for whatever reason. And we've learned that, as opposed to like in the individual programs, if it's not broad, it might restrict us in some way. That's something I'm like trying to understand and grapple with as I'm going through this process for the first time too.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Okay, any other questions, comments before we kind of open up the second draft at this point? And also, let's keep it in mind. I mean, I think this is a good discussion about, with the experience that you all have, kind of as you're going through this, like, hey, will this particular criterion, would that fit into this grant program that I'm really familiar with, be it restoration, technical assistance, stakeholder engagement, going down the line.
I guess just on that point, or sort of following on Dirk's comment, he basically took the words out of my mouth in terms of those differences. I'm one of the people that reached out after the last rack and sort of talked about this with Jesse and Eric. I do struggle a lot with thinking about how to think about these rules and how they would apply and be implemented at this level when all the grant programs are so different. And I don't feel like, I'll say that differently. I feel like you could still put it in the specific grant programs and still be broad. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. Even if you're tying it to the specific grant type, the language can still be broad. And I would say in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and climate mitigation and adaptation and sort of the broad language that is being used, I don't foresee that science changing is going to change those things being important. And the other thing I guess I'd mention is looking at the existing criteria, and I'm most familiar with like restoration. I'm least familiar probably with the water acquisition grants or land acquisition grants. There's things in here that I feel like are, and I've said this in the the listening sessions, that we're already doing and maybe could be doing it better. But in the existing criteria like restoration, watershed context is one of the bubbles. Well, climate change is part of that context. So maybe we need to be doing that better as applicants, and the guidance for the review, for the applicants and the reviewers can be improved. But is there a new rule needed for that? Climate, we should already be incorporating climate change into our watershed context and addressing ecosystem function and processes. So I'm just, it doesn't need a new rule, but for that, is that just education? So I'm struggling with that sort of thing. Like, what are we already doing? Do we need new rules for some of those things, or just better education and guidance? And then again, how these will play out across the grant types at that level when the grant types are so different. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I think that's really good insights. And that my quick response to your I'm a little agnostic when it comes to whether we should have them in Division 5 or we could break them out and put them into the individual rules for each of the grant types. So I think it's a great discussion to have moving forward. Whether your last point about say like a watershed context, how that fits in the evaluation criteria. I think it's really important for our board to have specific climate related evaluation criteria. So that's where we're moving forward here. If there's places where we can maybe add to existing rules, like add, some language into those existing evaluation criteria, that might be an option. But I know that there's it's important to have specific climate related criteria for our board. Okay, before we go on, so somebody just joined via phone.
Yeah, this is Anne. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I'm having some technical difficulties, so I've joined by phone for at least a moment.
All right, thanks.
All right.
Bruce.
Yeah, I'm also struggling with all this. So if you had sort of the general in Division 5 and then maybe tailored it through guidance or something else, is the Division 5 really intended as kind of a statement of policy, or does OWEB already, you've got a policy? Or, what's the function of that?
Why Division 5?
Or, if you address it at the more specific level of individual grant program types, do you need that kind of broad general statement there? I mean, I look at this and I say, to make it work at the broad level, you're going to have to add that where appropriate to every one of those things, which starts to become it's not appropriate here, so I'm not going to pay any attention to that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. And then, because you pointed out in our revised evaluation criteria number 1, where we added the where appropriate to the engaging local communities, meaningfully engaging local communities. So I'm sensing maybe a movement towards, hey, let's think about how these would apply within the individual grant type rules. So I've seen some nodding heads there too. So again, I think we're definitely open to that, and I don't think it would require a whole lot of different language than what we have right now. I mean, I could see some of these already applying to all the different grant types, some a little easier than others. But like I said, I think it'd be good just to keep it in mind as we're moving forward today. And maybe we can make kind of a note of it too, like as we're going through these. So, hey, for this evaluation criteria number 1, this seems like it would fit in stakeholder engagement, maybe technical assistance, maybe restoration, but let's talk about it. So
that one
okay.
Is that do you want to get started on that? I mean, is that what we're doing here? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think Jesse, if you're ready to pop up the.
Because that engagement, community engagement stuff is sort of a scale dependent thing for the project. I mean, there's some kind of projects, where it's most appropriate is at the planning conceptual level where, what's the priorities, what's important, and have that inform the work that gets done. It's not that important in trying to develop a monitoring program or design a monitoring program or, what's the technical side of a restoration proposal, seems to me. So I think that one is more important in some types of grants than others, Brian.
Okay, so you're talking specifically there, Bruce, about the number one.
Yep.
How the applicant meaningfully engages local communities disproportionately impacted by climate change where appropriate. And yeah, so definitely for planning purposes and engaging landowners and others in order to design and implement projects.
I think I have a question about that number one specifically as well. Is what are we using to determine whether a community is disproportionately impacted by climate change? I mean, some places may not have that information, or it would just be kind of a guess. Is there some good, does anyone have thoughts on that, like where that comes from and how we gauge that? I mean, we can talk about communities that we're impacting and make guesses about the climate change impacts there, but and probably some basins have studies and things done on that, but I guess I'm concerned how we're going to quantify that or determine that.
Thanks, Heather. I think and a lot of this we're putting a lot of weight, I think, on the definition here,
Mm-hmm.
where we have the local communities disproportionately impacted. We left it blank right now because I think we need to have that discussion as a RAC. Natasha Bellos is from the Chutes Land Trust, was not able to join us today. However, she had some thoughts on, perhaps a starting point of a definition there around, pulling from previous state legislation, which had some, I think, at least a good starting point that we could probably talk through as a RAC, either today or probably most likely at the next meeting, once we have maybe put some language down there for you to chew on and react to. But definitely curious if folks have other ideas or resources that could be used to define this. Alex, see your hand up.
Yeah, hi. I don't necessarily want to derail if we still have more to say about this point about Rule 1 there. But I kind of just wanted to get into or make the suggestion for Rule 2 there, talking about the resilience for natural resources and or human communities. And I think natural resources can be really broadly interpreted. So, water, oil, cobalt, and maple syrup could all be considered natural resources. And so I wonder if the word we don't want to use in place of natural resources is ecosystem services. And I don't know how people feel about that. That is resilience of ecosystem services in the context of climate adaptation is sort of how I think about these things. And then I guess along with that, with Rule 3 there, carbon sequestration would be an ecosystem service. And so we're sort of giving disproportionate weight to this one ecosystem service. This is kind of continuing off conversations in the previous meeting. Granted that particular ecosystem service is very important in the context of mitigating climate change. But at the same time, there's a huge inequality across ecosystems of the ability to actually perform that ecosystem service, because carbon sequestration sort of naturally is something that occurs, at a minimum at the regional scale, and very different across different ecosystems. And so in this part of the state, any given project, the ability to sequester carbon might not be huge. However, functioning ecosystems delivering the full suite of ecosystem services might be able to more broadly sequester carbon based on those processes and their impact and feedbacks at a more regional scale. And so I do wonder if we should walk number 3 back a little bit.
This is Anne. I would like to speak to that a little bit as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad to hear that we're having this conversation, because I've had the same kind of difficulties wrapping my head around breaking them out into these 3, because as I look at the 3 different categories as they're broken out, or criteria right now, it seems to me that number 2 is really the one that's most likely to apply to all the different grant programs, whereas carbon sequestration, that can be very specific, and the same with the stakeholder engagement, that may not be appropriate for all types. And so I think we said in the last meeting there was no weighting, but I wonder if perhaps there should be some weighting, or as we've been talking about, and I don't want to duplicate anything because I did drop off the meeting for a moment, though, I'm taking these out and applying them to each division. I too am having kind of struggles with that and wondering what the best way to proceed is.
Okay, thanks, Ann. We've jumped ahead to both kind of 2 and 3, which is okay. I don't want to derail any discussion on those, but I also want to kind of go back to number 1. We talked about that being most applicable to planning or stakeholder engagement type projects, perhaps some when it involves restoration. But are there other thoughts on, well, Kristen, I see your hand up, so I'll go to you.
Yeah, just a couple on that. So Teresa put a link in the chat for an EPA definition. And I was looking at the governor's executive order, the 20-04, the climate executive order, which lists lots of different communities in one of its whereas, or the second whereas statement, that could be disproportionately impacted depending on the impact itself and the communities. And like you say, I'm sure there's the environmental justice climate committee, I'm not sure the name of it, that was formed in Oregon. So I'm sure there's language out there that's relevant and specific to Oregon as well. And then on the piece about which grant types, and I know I'm one of the ones saying hard to figure out how to apply to the different ones, but I also could see potentially this applying to monitoring or developing, what a group would want to monitor and how, if you're thinking of urban impacts, flooding, water quality, stormwater, all sorts of ways, coastal communities, tides, climate, things like that. So I think what you monitor and how and who's leading that and how you're communicating the data to which communities could also be relevant for this.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, and thank you, Teresa, for that link as well. Kristen, I think you kind of hit on, especially here at number 1, where there's the obvious linkages, but then you start kind of thinking about it a little bit more, and you see, oh, maybe there is more linkages, and that's kind of where we were kind of noodling around and ended up with the where appropriate language, because for some restoration projects, the example I think we talked about last time, you have a culvert project in the middle of the forest somewhere. There's probably not a lot of opportunities to meaningfully engage local communities to do so. So, this doesn't seem to be a fair evaluation criterion versus one where if you're doing a big riparian project in the middle of a city park, well, there's going to be probably more opportunities to do engagement there. They're both restoration projects. So having that language around where appropriate, we felt doesn't penalize applicants where they have a project where there's really no conceivable way to engage communities, but at the same time allows folks who do have those opportunities to expand upon that in their application materials. Alex, see your hand up.
Yeah, I think just going along with kind of similar to what you're getting at, in addition, maybe to where appropriate, specifying, I mean, maybe this is already implied, but the language disproportionately, that word implies some level of relativity here. And so adding the language within an applicant's operating area, just because that might help with some disambiguation as it applies to disproportionate impacts. I don't know if, I mean, there are communities within our operating area that are disproportionately impacted by climate change in the broadest definition, but I could also think about, just things that have disproportionate impacts just within the context of our operating area. And so this could help prioritization. And also, it keeps it relative to sort of what we're able to do as organizations in our own strengths.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Bruce. Oh, you're on mute still.
You're muted, Bruce.
I'm sorry. This probably belongs more in guidance, I think, but particularly around some of the monitoring sorts of things and community engagement. I think part of what we're trying to get at here is getting people to think about what questions we're asking for monitoring or whatever, which often are very technical kinds of ones. And this might be a way to spur people to, rethink that and say, what's important to these communities we're trying to address, which often is more a social science form of element to a monitoring program rather than just a project. And if there's some way to recognize that, or and I don't even know if OWEB funds much in the way of the social science forms of monitoring in connection with restoration work, but it seems like it's an opportunity to try to incentivize that.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. We do, if it has that direct tie to future conservation or restoration actions, if applicants are able to make that link. And I know I can think of some specific examples down in Southern Oregon related to forest restoration, forest resiliency activities where that social tie is, or the social buy-in is really important in order to engage in that work. So applicants have made a good tie-in there with future restoration work and kind of that social science piece.
Thank you.
Eric, I wanted to bring up one of the comments that we got from one of the RAC members who wasn't able to attend today, but they did flag in those first criteria the use of local, when you add that to the criteria, you're limiting the use of broad-based communities such as people of color or those dependent on salmon. I said the salmon people. So the flag that we're not like, do we want to use that word local in this criteria? Does it limit it in some capacity? So I just wanted to make sure to bring that up as food for thought for the group.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Because we had added local, I believe, during the last RAC meeting. So, are there any reactions to, if we were to remove local, given what Jesse just noted? Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Sorry, maybe if we said stakeholders rather than local communities, at least in Southeastern Oregon, we have spent many years with the Harney Basin trying to get everybody to understand that local, there are many stakeholders that aren't just local, but that care very deeply and have a stake in things. So it's a little broader term there. The community is broader than just local in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that would open it up like for the salmon, discussion. If you're improving water quality and the effects are going to be seen downstream, then or increasing salmon populations, then you could bring in that community that maybe not in your community, but down in the river, lower down. So kind of like that change.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Thanks, Heather. Helena, then Dirk.
Yeah, I also agree. I mean, I think we need to have some term there. I think stakeholder works really well. I can see, local community working as well, but we need to be, it's one of those balances of having enough definition, but still being broad to be inclusive. But it can't be so broad that it kind of loses its definition, its oomph, if we don't give some specificity. So I think stakeholders works as a replacement term.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dirk.
Yeah, I think stakeholder is probably a pretty good term. I guess my concern is if you're working on a project in, the upper John Day, for salmon, the salmon fishermen down at the mouth of the Columbia are potential stakeholders. And at what level do you need to engage people who might be affected by your effect to a project? It's the balance between, connecting to the right people who would have an important contribution to your project versus just reaching out to anybody who may or may not be affected by the project. So I think we need to, at least have that focused.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. And I mean, I'm curious I know you've been a grant reviewer for a long time now, and as you would kind of look at a potential project, with that in mind, I think you would maybe have that critical eye towards, hey, this really is the community that they should be engaging in. Maybe there's some downstream benefits to communities, but the level of engagement probably doesn't need to be there.
In most of my experience, it is more that local community. So like if working in the John Day, you're working with the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs who have, ceded lands in that area. You're working with the local communities. If I'm evaluating a project to see if it's going to be successful, you want to make sure you're not missing somebody who would have major issues or concerns or might be problematic. But you do need to constrain if I'm going to be reviewing something. It's like, well, people are, stakeholders for this. It's like, where do you draw the line of the term stakeholder? And I think, local is kind of a,
I guess it could be defined too local by some, if and that it's also a concern, like you not looking outside maybe your, your Sickfield watershed.
Okay. I don't know who had their hand up first. I'll go Alex and then Kristen.
Sorry, yeah, mine's just quick. I kind of playing off what Dirk made a really good point, and I work in the Upper John Day, and we do have sort of a balance that we have to strike. We work with the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and those relationships are great, and it really is a big priority, to enhance and preserve first foods for tribal members. But we also have to strike a balance because a lot of our work is taking place. A lot of critical systems are on private lands, and so we have to maintain those relationships. And all the stakeholders are definitely important to us, but the most local ones are the ones who can really shut projects down for us, or make our ability to operate on our lives very difficult. So yeah, there definitely is not to, I guess, throw up too much opposition to what we're talking about, but that's very much a consideration out here, that the more we focus our efforts on things that are broad and not necessarily direct benefits to our local community members, the more at odds we place ourselves with the local community members who really have the ability to make operating and doing these things difficult.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, thanks. Two things. One, just to offer in terms of the wordsmithing conversation, in the stakeholder engagement criteria, again, looking at the bubble diagram, one of the criteria says applicants engage with appropriate stakeholders in the appropriate geography. And those are all very open to interpretation, but that's how it's worded sort of already in that one particular grant type. And then I think another piece in terms of community, and I think that language is trying to get to that, is community sort of a geographic community, an area on a map, or when you're talking about community, which I think was the original intent of this one, is sort of distinct populations or subpopulations. Are you talking about the Latino community, or the BIPOC community, or the rural or coastal, or economically disadvantaged, or whatever? And so are you talking about a geographic community, the town of Independence, or within that town, the different communities that are, again, disproportionately impacted by climate change because they don't have air conditioning, because they don't have a seat at the decision-making table, because whatever. So I think there's different ways to think about that word.
Yeah, good point. Okay, anything else on the language specifically in number 1? And then Jesse has started to note some of the grant types where this would be applicable. Again, with the caveat, as we kind of get into these, that some of the grant types, this will be applicable in certain instances with restoration. I could see this also playing a role in both the water and land acquisition grant programs, as well as technical assistance. Again, with technical assistance, if you're doing a design for a large wood placement in the middle of the forest, it's probably not going to be applicable. But if you're doing a design around a dam removal project that's, you know, near a municipality or population source, yeah, you're going to want to be engaging. So, Bruce.
Yeah, when you mentioned the land acquisition and remind, that's one of the touchy issues and the tensions in the land acquisition world is that typically land acquisitions, there's not much community engagement on the upfront side with stakeholders because these are transactions with individual private landowners and they're very touchy. So certainly engaging affected stakeholders and communities about what you might do with the land when you own it is an appropriate thing. It's very hard to do that. Should we seek to acquire this landowner's piece of property? That's a much more difficult one.
Yeah, I recognize that, Bruce. And also, you know, acknowledging that if you get to the point, well, you know, not getting too far into the weeds on OAB's land acquisition grant program, but you know, we require a public hearing once you get to a certain point. And you know, if that engagement hasn't occurred and it's you know, potentially a surprise to people in the community, then it might run into issues. But yeah, I really acknowledge your remarks there, Bruce, on kind of going in at the right time and figuring out how to have those conversations with communities. So Jesse's noted, yeah, applies, you know, to all grant programs, potentially, some more than others, of course. And before we go to number 2, I see we're at almost 10 o'clock. How are folks doing? Do we need a 10-minute break? Do you want to kind of push? Seeing nodding heads. So let's pause here, reconvene, we'll do 10 minutes. So 10:07, and we'll get into number 2. Okay, so it's 10:07, 10:08. Let's dive back in. So we are on to our criterion number 2 right now, which is how changing climate conditions are incorporated into the project design and implementation, and how the project will contribute to adaptation and resilience for currently as natural resources. Alex had the suggestion about swapping that out with ecosystem services and or human communities. So thoughts on that language? Anne, I see your hand up, and Bruce, I think you have a hand up too, but I don't know if it's a stale one or not. So we'll go Anne, and then Bruce if you have a comment.
Okay, I was just going to say on number 2, I had a couple of comments. One, as far as the potential for ecosystem services, I don't specifically have a problem with the natural resources as it is. I'm happy to discuss ecosystem services, but human communities is also in that definition, which I tend to think of as a reason to use ecosystem services as opposed to a phrase like ecosystem function. And I guess the other thing, and I will ask OWEB to correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the natural resources specific to each grant type are spelled out more specifically within each of those grant types. Is that correct? For instance, with the restoration criteria, I know it specifically mentions native species, for example, native fish species and other natural resources that are being targeted by that grant type.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, throughout the application, I think it would be referencing whatever natural resource the applicant is trying to conserve, restore, improve. So that would be, hopefully fairly obvious in that application.
And the second kind of issue with number 2 that I wanted to talk about or hear others' opinions on is we have the changing climate conditions being incorporated into design and implementation. And this may be largely more something that should be in the guidance, but I think it might be important to include if a project really like hits on a prioritization that is like a statewide priority through the climate lens specifically, like areas that have been determined to be potentially more resilient or more important from a connectivity standpoint for
and at least on my end, you've frozen.
Darn, I was really interested in hearing what she was going to say next.
Yeah, sorry, Anna. If you want to try to rejoin via phone, then we can come back to you.
Sometimes just turning off the video helps with that bandwidth issue.
Okay, well, while Anne gets that figured out, Bruce.
Yeah, and I think I would echo what she was starting to say. One of the points was that touch on that I don't think we quite get to here is the significance or importance of, the project or the benefits here from a climate standpoint. It's one thing to say, well, we incorporated it into the project design, and I would say, for land acquisitions and maybe water acquisition, project design per se, these are the project is a transaction. So, there are things beyond the transaction that ultimately become part of the project, but OWEB is only funding usually the transaction. So terminology is a little off. And the final thing that maybe it's implied here, but I would be more comfortable if there was something more specific referring to the durability of the conservation benefits. That's what changing climate does. It renders some of the things we want to do irrelevant after a while. And you may generate benefits for a certain period of time, but it's good for OEB to understand whether it's really going to have the conservation benefits are going to be sustained over time.
Bruce, I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that point because do you feel like that durability component could serve as a stand-in for the first part of this number 2, how changing climate conditions are incorporated into project design and implementation? Because I see those as the same, or like one side of the coin or the other. Like that when you're getting at durability, that is assuming that you are incorporating climate change conditions, because if you weren't incorporating them, it would fail. So is that sort of what you're getting at there?
I think so, and it's really a kind of a structure thing. It's more focuses on the outcomes rather than, how did you write your grant application? And if the outcome is durable conservation benefits, that's what is important to me, at least. It's exactly how you did it in the project design, and I think the durability is a byproduct of the project design, but sometimes it's not relevant. And as I think Ann was starting to say, it may not be very important in the larger scheme of things. So having something that got at that important significance might be a good thing as well.
Heather, I see your hand up.
The durability piece, could that be added potentially to the second sentence, maybe? The contributing to adaptation, resilience, and durability. Just throwing that out there, that's my first thought. And then my second thought is for projects like monitoring projects where the project has already been designed and implemented, maybe we could add something, how changing climate conditions are/were, if we're going to cover like monitoring, or does it make sense to just have that they are incorporated when you're doing a monitoring project for a project that was already done or whatever? So bringing in that monitoring piece, how do we do that? Maybe we say are/were incorporated into the project design, or is that making people put something in there that maybe they don't know, or they weren't a part of the design or implementation or something like that?
Yeah, how do folks feel about adding a were there?
It might be confusing. I think, Heather, to your point, the thing that's getting reviewed is the monitoring proposal, is the project in essence. So how climate change is getting incorporated into that proposal, even if the restoration action or whatever that the monitoring is meant to monitor maybe didn't incorporate climate change, but that what you're proposing to do, that they're reviewing and applying these criteria to, is incorporating that, if that makes sense. So I think review team members could say,
I think if you think about it in that way a little bit longer, that makes sense. Yeah, we don't want to add unnecessary confusing language there, for sure.
Okay, good. So I see Anne has joined. Anne, you had us on the edge of our seat when your Zoom kind of froze. So I think I'll give the floor back to you to kind of to finish your thought there.
Okay, I'm sorry about that again. Where I don't actually know where I froze, so.
I think you were making if I recall, I think you were making the point around, there's places that may be of high priority for conservation or restoration based on you know, known future impacts of climate change.
Okay, great. Yeah, that really was the main thing. Just wondering, again, knowing that much of it would probably be in the guidance to provide flexibility and to understand that groups and agencies are currently working on these types of prioritization efforts as the science continues to evolve. But yes, I wondered if there was potentially some language that might be included, particularly in this piece, that does point to priorities that have been identified as state priorities through that climate lens.
Yeah, I mean, and we ask in our applications about, you know, some of the planning documents that applicants are pulling from and how they kind of prioritize this project. And, you know, this could definitely be a place where in guidance, I think we could make sure it's clear that, you know, that as we move into the future, there is or will be planning documents that will kind of reflect sort of these hot spots that folks could be focusing on. Oh gosh, Kristen and then Heather.
Thanks. Yeah, a couple things on that point about the prioritization of climate change impacts, the plans or other priorities agencies are working on. I think it's just important to note, it seems to me if that was included, it would change the weight almost of this, of just to the technical level you are considering climate change, you're incorporating it into your plans, you're understanding species selections or culvert sizing or whatever that you should be thinking about as you plan your project, versus is this a climate priority project and did you properly size, species select, so versus like we locally prioritize this culvert replacement because it's a fish passage barrier or a you know, infrastructure thing or whatever, the community decided this was important, versus ODF&W has said this is a climate priority and therefore we have prioritized it. And those are two different things to me. So I'd just be mindful of what the intent is on that. And then I don't love ecosystem services as a phrase. I just feel like it's a little jargony. And I wonder just about ecosystems. So in terms of natural resources, adaptation and resilience for ecosystems, because it's sort of what we're working on. So throwing that out there.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. You know, to your first point, yeah, I think I agree. That we're looking at probably two separate concepts here. I think we could, in you know, like I said, in the on the guidance piece, make sure that folks are aware of and are keying in on when applicable that there is or will be guidance around you know, hotspots for focusing on climate conservation and restoration actions, and that's sort of independent of I think what we have here in number 2, but it's already in existing criteria. So I think we would just kind of beef that up in guidance. To your point on ecosystems, what's the temperature of the room on using that?
I like
Yeah.
it.
Oh. I think it's great because I was just thinking about it in terms of number one, we talk about engaging the local communities. And so if we changed in number 2 to ecosystems, then you could incorporate the communities within that. And so then it's talking about the impacts. You know, if you're not directly engaging those communities, but you want to talk about the impacts to those communities, then if you had ecosystems there, it could cover that.
I'm just chewing on that one a little bit, Heather. So are you saying that local communities or stakeholders, wherever we end up landing there, would be sort of covered by ecosystems, or they are
Yeah,
part of the ecosystem?
yeah. I mean, I think because in number one, we're asking how we're engaging with these communities or stakeholders. And then in number two, it's how that, we want to talk about how those climate conditions are going to contribute to the adaptation or resilience. But if we switch it to ecosystems, does that then cover the local communities, as part of the ecosystem?
Mm-hmm.
And not just ecosystem services or the natural resources, but the communities as a whole too. So because if number one is focused on engaging them, then number two, if we had changed it to ecosystems, it could cover just that, hey, we're going to be providing adaptation and resilience from people in a flood prone area downstream, for example, but maybe the project doesn't like directly engage them, but it has that benefit. I guess, sorry,
Okay.
It does say human communities.
Well, so that was my next question, though, is that if we say, in your mind, if we have ecosystems there, does that then preclude the use of, or preclude us even saying human communities, because human communities are then
I don't know then. I mean, I think that maybe having the human communities part is important in there, and then the ecosystem. Yeah. I think ecosystems and leaving human communities would be good.
Be clear.
And then ecosystems could incorporate ecosystem services, a whole range of things.
Okay. So earlier we had referenced, maybe I'll just pause here and let Jesse kind of do your work. Okay. Yeah, we had mentioned number two, that we think it's pretty broadly applicable across OEB's grant programs. But I wanted just to test that assumption with y'all. Seen some nodding heads. And Kristen, hand up, so go ahead.
I mean, I think so, and obviously in different ways. The one, maybe the thinking about sort of the links in the chain, so to speak, is like stakeholder engagement in its own right. How would it contribute? Maybe I was thinking about this more with the sequestration and storage of carbon one. And then it's, okay, but what project is the stakeholder engagement intending to lead to that could contribute to these things? So that, and then monitoring again, similarly, if you're trying to understand the habitat of a particular species, it may or may not, unless it just depends on how broad you're thinking about it. Biodiversity is linked to climate change. There's been a huge conversation about that in the last year. So you can make those connections, but I guess it just depends on how broadly or specifically we're thinking of that.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah. Will you at OEB, will you guys be rolling up this information to report like at a statewide level or something? So I guess my question is, are there specific things that you're looking for that would be an answer that you could roll up and say, yes, OEB is meeting these climate criteria or these things by doing this, this, and this, or is this information not going to be used that way? Because I think then having it, broad and people write in just kind of what they're thinking is great, but if there's a specific like target you're trying to meet or whatever, then I think we can be a little more specific with it.
Thanks, Heather. I'm gonna actually look to Jesse for that one.
Yeah. So for the adaptation and resilience, I think that will be more internally developed with OWEB board and staff, because I think it's something our board is interested in us trying to develop some metrics to track a little bit along these lines. For the third criteria, the Oregon Global Warming Commission National Working Lands is convening a group right now to develop activity-based metrics. And we, it's something that we will be required to report on at some point. The metrics haven't been identified yet, but it is something that's planned, that where whenever they say I don't know, metric tons of carbon stored or sequestered or something, there's a chance that we will, I don't know what, like I said, the metrics haven't been created yet or haven't been identified yet, but there are groups working to develop those now, and we will be reporting on those, I believe, annually.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, anything else? Yeah, Kristen.
Sorry. Maybe this is a chicken and egg question, but Jesse, that makes me wonder, for the metrics OWEB will be developing, do you develop the metrics first and then the criteria, or the criteria and then the metrics that fit under that? I know it's a circular sort of iterative process, but it just, I guess making sure that I don't know, or does that question make sense?
It does. And, I think there's going to be, I think whatever metrics that we come up with are going to end up being pretty broad to start, pretty general to start, just because that's kind of where the field of adaptation and resilience is when it comes to metrics. They're not highly technical. And so I think that whatever criteria we come up with here and how we then develop metrics around it, I don't imagine it's going to be so incongruous that they don't work together, right? Like I said, when you look at metrics for adaptation and resilience, they're so general right now. They're so broad, and I think we'll just have a lot of flexibility. So I wouldn't get too hung up on it for this particular one, number 2.
Great. Okay, any other thoughts on number 2? Either the language itself or how it may apply to OWEB grant programs?
Eric, I wanted to follow up on something that we talked about earlier around the durability piece, and Bruce, your point about the project design and implementation not necessarily applying as well to land acquisition. So is that, if we added durability in as another component to this rather than replacing it, do we need to then say something about another as appropriate to that first piece about changing climate conditions are incorporated into project design and implementation where appropriate or as appropriate, or because I guess when I think about incorporating it into project design from a land acquisition perspective, you could specifically, I know, for example, the map, the resilient lands map, and people specifically picked lands that TNC identified as resilient lands to then pursue for land acquisition projects. And so to me, that is incorporating climate into your design, because you're specifically targeting acquisitions in places that are going to be resilient to climate. So I feel like it does apply in that context, but I just wanted to just kind of put that out there, get some thoughts on
I-
that from you.
I think it's still relevant, the first part of that. It's the phrasing about project design and implementation. I mean, I wonder if it would be covered if you say how changing climate conditions are incorporated into the project, maybe. I mean, the project, it's when you say design, some things just aren't designed like that. But I think it's an important question to be addressing. Or incorporated or reflected or, yeah, probably, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I kind of like that too, because it takes the design and implementation piece out. So it opens it more up to all the grant types.
If we remove design and implementation.
Yeah.
Other thoughts on that one?
Thinking back, as Kristen, on our first meeting when Jesse was summarizing some of the responses to the climate change information gathering questions y'all had started using, that responses to that particular question were maybe some of the least well articulated. And so I think maybe for the guidance, just being really clear on what it is you're talking about, then if the criteria removes those words, examples of that. And again, it'll be broad and there'll be more beyond that, but just the clarity around that, because now we're making it less specific. So, and when you've already seen that people either aren't doing it or didn't understand what you were asking or what to articulate, or maybe both, it seems a need for more guidance.
Okay, clear guidance. Good. Okay, let's move on then to number 3, how the applicant seeks to further climate mitigation efforts in the state through greenhouse gas emissions reductions and/or long-term sequestration or storage of carbon. So we've combined some here to try to kind of make it a holistic. We got the front end and the back end on greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration and storage. Let's go Helena, then Anne.
Thanks. I think somebody else brought this up as well, but just wondering how this specifically could apply to all of the grant types. It seems, from my perspective, a lot of the grants that I work with the local watershed organizations and soil and water conservation districts, a lot of it is around restoration projects or technical assistance. And so just trying to think about how this could apply to those. I guess I'm struggling a little bit as how this could apply to across the board to all grant types. To me, this is a little bit more specific perhaps to ones rather than others. And if, I am on the western side of the state, so, we have opportunities for, planting eelgrass for carbon sequestration, for, those types of activities that might be different on the east side of the state. And so are there the same opportunities across the state for implementing long-term sequestration or storage of carbon? And if not, is this a equal or fair opportunity to then weight projects? I don't necessarily have a solution for this one, but just some questions that have ran through my head while reading this particular one.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. Good questions. I don't know if I saw, Dirk, your hand went up for if it's a response to Helena or if it's something separate. So okay, so we'll go Anne and then you, Dirk.
Well, really, I think Helena hit on it really well. That's the same that I've been struggling with. I can see how number 2 really can apply to pretty much all of the projects, but I don't want to penalize an applicant that has a great project. It's just not a sequestration or carbon storage project, because those other project types can be extremely beneficial from a climate adaptation and resilience standpoint as well. So yeah, I think I'm struggling as well with like whether or not there should be some weighting, or maybe the addition of the where appropriate language again, if that might help. I don't know the solution either. I just am having some struggle with it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Anne. Go ahead, Dirk, and then Alex.
So I guess I got 2 thoughts. Something I've been struggling with is how these criteria, all 3 of them, apply to different grants. But I guess when you look at it as their evaluation criteria, so it's how you're going to be comparing one grant to another. So some of them might get extra bonus points because they describe it better or have a greater effect, but it's not like it's a do not fund criteria. At least I'm not reading it that way. So that's one thought, makes me a little bit like, okay, applies to all the programs as applicable, makes it more manageable for me. But for number 3, I do struggle a little bit. Just because of, I think about, okay, if I'm doing a monitoring grant and I'm looking to do LiDAR flights, well, if you're flying a plane, you're using a ton of greenhouse gas emissions compared to going out and doing on the ground surveys. How do you compare the greenhouse emissions of 15 trips on site to, do surveying versus flying the site once? Like, I just don't know if we really have the tools to evaluate some of those mitigation efforts defined well enough to really incorporate it. So that's my concern there, is like, I guess applicants could speak to it as best they can, but I think it could be spin any number of ways depending on the data that they want to use.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I think that's, at least in my mind, with number 3 is at least initially one where it's going to be a lot of qualitative. How are folks, looking to incorporate these considerations into their project?
Yeah, maybe they speak to it, and so it's how you actually speak to it in your application, whether or not, so at least you're showing that you've considered it.
Okay, go ahead, Alex, and then Bruce.
Yeah, I'm probably belaboring the point at this point, but I that was sort of my gripe with this 3rd one, is I don't foresee it being something that's going to push a ton of change in the way any operations are done. It's just going to be an exercise in figuring out how things that we already do relate to carbon sequestration, either directly or indirectly, and probably most likely indirectly. But I guess maybe the suggestion I had for it, because we've been talking about weighting and Dirk makes a good point of it probably isn't a fund, do not fund criteria, but I do wonder if an and/or between 2 and 3 would sort of mitigate some of these concerns. That the consideration is included, but not necessarily doesn't create any exclusivities. I don't know.
Is that what you meant, Alex? Yep.
Okay. Go ahead, Bruce.
To be honest, I really don't think the emissions reductions piece is significant enough to even be in rule. I mean, that's not what OWEB's grant program is much about. I mean, that might be a nice bonus point, I think, as Dirk was suggesting, but to lead people to believe that, that's going to be a driver for funding decisions. Yeah, I'm not sure that's good. And the other thing I struggle with here is just the construction of the sentence, at which it really focuses on how the applicant presents himself, the proposal, what they're seeking to do, rather than what the outcome is and the significance of the outcome. I think it's really important to know if there's going to be big carbon storage benefits, or if by chance some project here is going to make a major impact on emissions reductions. But I'd like to, be able to judge that on the significance or magnitude of the benefits, rather than, what they claim to be trying to do.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, Dirk, I see your hand back up again.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking a little bit more about number 3, and I'm wondering if we could, I don't know exactly the verbiage for it, but maybe something along the line about how the applicant has considered, climate mitigation efforts, or greenhouse gas. So it shows that they've at least taken into account some of these factors, maybe not how they're going to further mitigate it, but that they're going to consider how their project has influences greenhouse gas emissions or carbon sequestration. It's definitely a little bit more, I don't know, gives them more wiggle room, but I think it's also maybe something more doable.
Yeah, I'll let Jesse cash up there.
And I did not articulate it very well here, but it's a good starting point for me to go back to later.
I didn't have it articulated that well either. It was just kind of a thought I was trying to get out there.
So I'll ask for reactions. On Dirk's friendly amendment there, I tend to like that, given I think what we've heard as being important for our board and others. So yeah, I'll ask and see, gauge reactions. Heather and then Teresa.
Yeah, I like the rewrite of this, especially as we're just starting off on these efforts. And I think we've talked about in the past, like, switching equipment over to different fuels and things like that. All of those things, or buying electric vehicles or whatever, that's all going to take a lot of time. And so I think having it be how we're considering these things is a good place to start. I also, it sounds like what Helena was saying, she knows the grasses that she's planting are good carbon storage choices, but I have no idea what would be a good, sure, planting plants probably stores carbon, but diving into the science of that, I don't really know the details. And so it would be just kind of guessing at this point. And how do you balance out, tipping trees that are alive into a stream and then saying that that's sequestering or storing carbon? So it's going to be kind of vague, I think, at first, until we maybe find out what the metrics are and get going on those. So I like the question being more how we're considering it, because it shows that we're sort of going along that thought process, but we may not have the right answers, or they may not be right, but we're trying to think about it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Teresa.
I kind of have a mixed feeling about, just the word consideration, because I feel like that, like, I like what Heather had just suggested in the thought process of that, but I feel like that language kind of allows too much wiggle room, and just saying, oh, we've considered it and we still didn't choose it. It's kind of like how NEPA doesn't have any teeth to, a lot of the projects that are going on nationwide, as well as that, like I feel like that opens a lot of like backdoor for applicants that can just say, oh, we've considered, but we still decided against it. And that would still allow room for OWEB to like award a grant for, projects that are not actually like furthering mitigation and sequestration efforts. Like maybe that's my unpopular opinion, but that's just how I feel around like a really vague language like that.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, I have some thoughts on that as well, but before I chime in, see Bruce, your hand up.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say maybe how consideration has informed the project, whatever follows that there. It's, what difference did it make in the project? It's not, we thought about it, please give us credit.
Oh, so consideration and informed. Okay. Go ahead, Helena.
I like that addition of informed the project, because I think that also then takes into consideration Heather's point of, do you let the tree continue to grow and sequester carbon versus tipping it in and adding to the opportunity for gravel to stack up behind it for spawning ground, ground recruitment? Where is that balance? Which are you going to weigh in the ecosystem services? Which is greater? So, sequestering more carbon or improving spawning grounds? Like, both are pretty darn important. Which is more important? So I think if you, by adding that language, inform the project, you can lay out, well, we've weighted both for this particular project for the benefits that we're seeing over time. Tipping over, 3 trees is going to add this benefit, which for our particular needs in our watershed is, go down that kind of line. But then it gives you an opportunity to kind of walk through and explain why the decision was made. So I think that works much better for me.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you articulated that really well. Because I was thinking of the large wood placement, the tree tipping example. As it stands right now, that's going to, perhaps rank out higher with number 2 here than number 3. But if there's if we have and allow for an opportunity for the applicant to discuss their thought process there, and maybe, yeah, we're going to tip over these 3 trees, but we're also going to be in those cavities, we're going to be replanting with some Western red cedar or something. So you're kind of, you're covering all your bases there a little bit, and you're able to explain and articulate that in the application.
I would just add that don't forget that these are in part of a whole other suite of criteria for restoration. So most of our other criteria ask about water quality benefits, species benefits, habitat benefits. From my understanding, like in restoration, for example, it's going to ask you about a lot of other considerations. And this carbon one is just one more. So it's like if you have like a large wood placement, although it'd be harder to talk about the GHG emissions reductions or carbon sequestration and storage, you've hit so many other benefits that are already in our other criteria, and then you've hit the adaptation and resilience benefits. So the carbon sequestration and storage is like, it's not as great, but like they achieved all these other benefits by doing this project. So I guess it's hard when we're so focused on 3 lines right here, but I just don't want us to forget the larger context in which there's a lot of other criteria that your projects are weighted on or evaluated on. And when you look at it, it's like it's the 8th one of 7 others, and you've met all 7. So like the 8th one, if you get like a neutral ranking on it, probably isn't gonna kick you out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a good reminder, Jesse. Thank you. Teresa, I'm going to ask if the language, the change here with adding the informed, how the considerations inform the project. Is that working better for you? Thumbs up.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Jesse, would you mind scrolling over? There we go. Okay, other thoughts on 3? Oh, so I'll also ask if that change to include the considerations and inform, does that then eliminate the and or for folks in between 2 and 3?
Yeah, I think that sort of satisfies the same mechanism.
Okay. Then I'll also ask, and you're thinking about OEB's grant programs, is this something that applies to all in some way, or is there a subset where it does not apply in your experience?
I think probably in my mind, one of the least fitting project types is monitoring. But it definitely seems like it would apply very well to restoration and stakeholder engagement in a way. And I think if I was doing a big monitoring project, for example, I might, to meet this criteria or to show something, I might talk about how we're going to carpool to the project sites, or do something like put out a continuous monitor instead of driving out there 3 times a week or something like that, but and if that sounds good, then great. But versus designing, a restoration project with a ton of different aspects of carbon storage and maybe the equipment you're using and things like that. So, yeah, and maybe water acquisition, it would be a little weird. I could see with land acquisition, because if you're gonna have land, so there's gonna be some carbon storage potential there. But anyway, so yeah, I think it can cover all the grant types, but at different levels.
All right, thanks, Heather. And that's where, I think you're kind of your example around carpooling or putting out a continuous monitor. I think those are great examples that could be worked into a grant application that would help address this criterion. Kristen.
Yeah, I think similar to sort of my comment on number 2, and again, how broad or narrow you interpret it. So I think like stakeholder engagement, in the implementation of stakeholder engagement, the sequestration or storage is probably limited, other than what project or acquisition are you trying to lead to in terms of that engagement. But the actual engagement itself, you're not really going to store carbon or anything. And then greenhouse gas emissions, and I think this goes to the prior conversation, just thinking about the trade-offs. Yeah, we could use Zoom, and maybe that helps us reach people, but it's also limiting accessibility to other people. So sort of that consideration and informed that we tried Zoom to reduce driving distance, but that limits access. And then therefore, number 1, maybe we're compromising our ability to meaningfully engage people by limiting who has internet and stuff like that. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I just want, honestly, that's, when you said that, Kristen, it reminded me that, our own board is kind of weighing on, hey, do we meet virtually? Because it's pretty efficient. We can do it, and it reduces environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions. But we're also missing out on, engaging with our stakeholders when we're doing everything virtually. So, there's definite trade-offs. So Jesse, you're writing, and then go to Dirk.
This is a little bit of a side, but just playing off what you were just saying. Sorry, did I jump my turn? But our RRT is meeting in person next week, while we had been doing it all through Zoom. So having the standards different for the restoration review teams and what we're asking of our applicants, I don't know, I think we should be thoughtful of that.
Yeah. Great. So Jesse, I know you have probably more experience with water acquisition than most of us here. What are your thoughts on how this one might apply?
It's a hard one to think about for that program. I'd have to look at it more. I honestly haven't thought a lot about it for this particular criteria with water acquisition, but it would be pretty challenging to fit there. I feel like you can more easily make the case for monitoring than you can for water acquisition. Monitoring, I'm like, you could, yeah. But anyways, I'd have to think about it a little bit and just think about what we would, just what's typically within a water acquisition program, like grant. So I don't know off the top of my head.
Thanks. And then I'm going to think through this a little bit more. Right? If this was a broad evaluation criterion that did apply to water acquisitions, but particularly at our current moment, if it really wasn't applicable right now, it's not going to ding anybody, because everybody's competing against one another, and nobody's going to get extra points here in the water acquisition program if you're not able to clearly articulate how your project meets criterion number 3 here. It's just going to go against all the other evaluation criteria that are in the that are existing in water acquisitions. So maybe it's not that big of a deal.
I think it would probably apply to some of the where we ask a little bit more about the larger context in which the acquisition is taking place, and if there's planned activities after, like around restoration or other kinds of project activities. So it's similar maybe to like stakeholder engagement, like what's the project that's going, if it's going to lead to another kind of project, and what's the potential there, for example. That might be, because there is something, there's a part of what we ask around that is in the application. And so I think that a little bit more and take a look at what we've got. But you're right, it wouldn't, theoretically, nobody would be able to answer it right now. So.
Okay. So we've made it through these three. I've kind of made notes here that there seems to be a fair amount of applicability across OAB's grant programs. Bruce, I'm going to leave aside for the moment the OAHP grants. I see some like succession planning on that side, which none of these are probably going to apply to, but so we'll maybe just put a pin in that for right now. But getting back, I think, to the conversation that we had kind of at the beginning of this meeting around, do we keep these in Division 5? Or do we tease them out and then add them to the individual grant programs? Are there further reflections on that, given that we kind of went through and noted that there's some broad applicability right now? Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I wonder if we use the as appropriate weasel words up in at the end of the introductory paragraph, then I could see maybe this might work for everything with the details coming in the guidance. If you say shall also be evaluated as appropriate on 1, 2, and 3. And then you wouldn't need where appropriate in other places, maybe. But it does introduce some ambiguity.
And then it would kind of put a lot of weight on guidance.
Yes.
I think. Yeah. How do folks feel about that? Maybe I'll put this out there. I mean, we also said at the beginning, hey, we're really willing to work on some of that draft guidance language for different grant programs and bring it to the RAC at the next meeting. So if we kept it in Division 5 for now and then came back with some of that language and guidance at the next meeting for y'all to chew on, would that work? Yeah, go ahead, Christian.
I'd appreciate that a lot. I think that would help. On this, I'm of two pretty distinct minds on the where appropriate sort of in the intro paragraph. The first thing that popped into my head was who decides the appropriateness the applicant or the review team or the, things like that. So that would be my question. I guess that question still holds for number one, where it's in there, but you can make the case in your application, I suppose. But anyway, it is quite fuzzy. As an applicant, it gives you a lot of leeway, but I don't know. So I was kind of two minds on that. But I'd appreciate the guidance. I think that would be really helpful. I think the conversation comes back to, yes, this can in some ways apply to, except with the discussion around number 3, to pretty much every grant program, but it's the how and the devil in the details that will matter. So.
Okay. Let's go Bruce and then Ann.
Yeah, I don't know if you can say this or want to say this in rules, but maybe you could say where appropriate as defined in guidance. And be specifically direct people to guidance, both reviewers and applicants.
Yeah, that would provide a little bit more clarity there, I think. Because yeah, guidance is where I think if I'm thinking about this the same way others are, is guidance is going to be where it's going to be decided if it's appropriate or not, or it's going to give the applicant that indication that, and the reviewer the indication that this is an appropriate evaluation criteria for a particular project. Go ahead, Anne.
I was just going to say that I think that I am okay with that language as long as it is in fact clear in the guidance. And so looking at the guidance would be great. And I'm just curious to know, is there going to be guidance for each, would this be added to existing guidance documents for each grant program, or would this just be a standalone guidance document that addresses the climate component?
I would prefer this to be as a part of standard guidance and not have a standalone. And we're at, I think, good timing in that we're looking to revise our applications, coming up here in the next 6-8 months anyway. So it's, I think, pretty good timing to lump this into what a revised application would look like, as well as guidance documents. Okay, any more thoughts on where we stand right now? Okay, so I'll recap where I think we're at right now and test that. So we got some really good feedback on the draft language here in 1 through 3, and the OEB team will work on making those revisions. We still have some definitions, I think, to suss out a little bit. And I think what we can do is come back with some language on those that are not defined right now for you all to chew on, as well as, we did have we had some thoughts that came in between these 2 RAC meetings. So on the existing definitions that we have on adaptation, mitigation, maybe resilience. So we'll probably do some edits in there too. So we'll have some revisions there. And then the big thing is to come in with some of that language and guidance. And I want to, again, not don't want to state that we're going to come in with final guidance language or it's going to be complete for every single grant type. But what we want to do is get a good sense from the RAC about the level of detail that we're putting into the guidance, and if we're at the right level for you all as we develop the guidance that will go into the revised applications. Does that sound okay?
To that last point, Eric, it would be helpful if folks want to provide some input right now on what grant types you'd like to see guidance developed for, draft guidance developed for which of these three. So for example, like I would really love to see you come back with some draft guidance for restoration program on number 3, or for restoration program on number 2 and 3. And I'd like to see what technical assistance would look like for number 2, or just to give us some parameters, what are the ones that you're like, this is what I want to provide some thoughtful feedback and input. I want to kind of see what you're trying to get at. If there's some priorities that you all see, that would help, at least me, as I'm putting together some of this guidance, and I'm making it as most relevant to the group as possible.
Okay, Dirk and then Kristen.
Yeah, just to feed off that question from Jesse, I think for me, the questions that the applications or grant programs that I'd like to see would be the ones that are not as clear cut for the existing guidance. So like, say, stakeholder engagement or technical assistance or monitoring. Those are the ones that I think could use the most kind of like, step down from what we've got so far.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say too, stakeholder engagement for me sticks out as teasing a lot of this apart. And then maybe for number 1, the restoration piece, because again, like the examples Eric gave, and maybe that's if you have time piece, it might be a little more obvious of what is not, like, oh, it's a culvert up on industrial timberland sort of way out versus, this other thing. So maybe that's not needed, but I think it will come into play when you're asking applicants to describe this for sure. And then I had a separate question that we can hold, but in the first meeting, Eric, you described the role of the RAC was talking about economic impacts of rules, and I think something else. I can't remember what the other piece was, but along those lines. And I was wondering when we get to that and if you all have any guidance on how we sort of think about that in advance of the next meeting, if that's when we're doing it or whenever we're having that conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, typically it's something that I would ask for people to just kind of think about throughout, and we can get back to it at the 3rd meeting. And, it's really kind of focused on small businesses is one focus there, but we're really interested in hearing about it broadly speaking as well. Like how would these rules, if adopted by the board, have economic impacts in your community? Bruce, I see your hand up.
Yeah, for land acquisition, which is probably most relevant as a model for the Ag Heritage Program rule eventually, I think number 1 needs some explanation, ways to address this within the context of land conservation projects, particularly. And maybe to a lesser extent, number two, I think a lot of people could probably figure out some way to address that. But, you know, it's different from the traditional restoration grant focus. Number one, particularly though, I think for land acquisition.
Okay. I think we have some good direction there, Jesse. Great.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? Also, just want to put it out there again. Jesse and I are available between now and the next track meeting. So, you know, if there's thoughts you have in the interim, you know, reach out. Email's great if you want to talk. You know, we're definitely open for that. And if not, really want to thank you all for a great conversation and feedback today. I'm always amazed that we come in here. I think, you know, we have 3 hours, and we're not going to take up the whole full 3 hours, but we have basically half a page of text, and we took up 2.5 hours on that. So my hat's off to you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to you both for leading us through so thoughtfully.
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
everybody. Conversation.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well,
Thank you.
thanks again. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Bye.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.